Okay, guys, welcome to AP World History, Chapter 10, Part 1 here. Talking about the Greeks, some things that we want to focus on right here on the board. First, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Two great stories that are still around today, but something that you need to focus on with them is that they showed the Greek maritime prowess, the fact that they were masters of the ocean and really controlled sea trade there in their region. It's also important to know that the Greeks linked distant lands through commerce. Phoenicia, Minoans, all distant lands that they're getting to because they were so good with their ships. Also important to know that the Greeks produced a high level of moral and philosophical thought. It's kind of what they're known for. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates being the father of philosophy, and these being three of the most famous philosophers of all time. The Greeks left a lot behind that would influence both the Arabs and the Europeans who came along later on in early pre-modern times. So let's talk. Let's get into early Greece. Early Greece was influenced heavily by the Minoans on the island of Crete, with the capital Knossos. The Minoans gave the Greeks basically language, linear A language. Their arts and crafts were traded to the early Greeks. Stories that later on would become Greek myths and stuff. Crete itself was influenced by the Phoenicians, and we'll talk a little bit more about. And basically the earliest Greeks that we really focus on were the Mycenaeans. They're part of southern Greece, and the Mycenaeans came in. They traded heavily with Crete, were influenced heavily by them, and when the Minoans fell, Mycenae pretty much takes over from there. The Mycenaeans will kind of organize a confederation of Greek city-states and will engage in a 10-year war with the Trojans, who lived across the Aegean Sea in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. While the Greeks won the war, this war really had disastrous consequences for the Mycenaeans because it drained a lot of their resources and their finances. And when they got back, you had invaders coming from the sea, you had the Dorians coming in, and they actually conquered by the Dorians, which led to a Dorian Dark Age, where the Mycenaean culture actually went backwards. People couldn't read or write during this time period, so some bad things going on there. Now, early Greece had no centralized state. It was very decentralized. A lot of that was due in part to geography. Rocky and mountainous, you had a lot of city-states developing independently of one another. You had monarchies in some places. You had oligarchies, which was ruled by a few people. You had aristocracies, where it was the rule by landowning noblemen. You had democracy in a few places, a fledgling democracy. And you also had ruled by tyrants, these generals who would kind of seize power. Sometimes they were good and sometimes they were bad. The early political unit for the Greeks was something called the polis. The poli began as a citadel or a fortress. This was a time period of a lot of raiding and chaotic, troubling times, and a lot of danger, and so people naturally gravitated towards these poli, and eventually they became more than just fortresses and citadels. They became actual city-states, which is the basis for the political unit. Of all the Greek city-states, without a doubt, the two most important were Athens and Sparta. Sparta itself had enslaved the neighboring peoples, the Messenians, and called them helots. These helot slaves' primary job in the world was to farm for the Spartans and keep them well fed. But they outnumbered the Spartans 10-1, and so Spartans, there was always this fear of a slave uprising, and in fact there was one that nearly overwhelmed the Spartans. And so they dedicated their entire lives to making themselves militarily powerful. They did this through various means, which we'll talk about a little bit more in class. In Spartan society, they didn't care about the frills and lace. They weren't about jewels and all that. They were about what can help them be efficient and effective. They didn't even use silver and gold for money. Money typically was iron bars and something like that that would still be useful if you had to melt it down. Now, eventually over the years, by the time the 4th century BCE rolled around, the Spartans had kind of got a taste for luxury, and their society really kind of changed. They still remained a military state, but you started seeing arts and luxury start creeping into Spartan society. There was a lot more equality in Spartan society versus some of the others. Women were trained to be tough. They were kind of little mini warriors in themselves, so they actually had more rights there than they did in Athens and some of these other places. As for Athens, it was an early form of democracy there in Athens, but early on only free adult males played a public role. Eventually that democracy will be extended to other peoples. A serious societal problem that was going on in Athens early on was the land distribution. You had land concentrated in the hands of just a few, these aristocrats, which meant that fewer people had land to make money off of, and so they were owing a lot of money. And so many of them were sold into slavery because of their debt. They owed money, so the only way to pay it off was to become slaves. It got to the point where there was going to be a general uprising, and into this stepped a man, very important man named Solon. You got a lot of unhappy people. Solon himself is an aristocrat. He is a rich man. He owns a lot of land, but he creates a compromise between the rich people and the poor people. And how he does, this is how he does it. He says, we're not going to give up any land. The aristocrats get to keep all the land that they have, but they abolish all the debt. If you owe money, you don't owe it anymore. They abolish debt slavery. You can no longer be sold into slavery because you owe money. And they also provided representation for the poorer people in the Athenian government. And this was enough of a compromise to get people to back off of the aristocrats. And so, for the most part, kind of solved the problem. Later on, democracy would get even better under a man named Pericles. He was a military general and ruler who ruled Athens through its golden age. He ruled for 32 years of the 50 years of Athens' golden age. He used money from the Delian League to glorify Athens and to strengthen democracy. And so we'll focus on those things a little bit more, and we'll see you again in part 2.